Hey everyone, in this video we'll be exploring Amazon Bedrock, which is a foundation model service provided by AWS. As we know in general, generative AI has really bloomed and expanded these last few years, and there's new LLMs coming on almost a weekly basis, and the capabilities continue to increase. They're getting more and more powerful, but there's still one question that always persists, right? What is the easiest way of accessing these models and actually working with them to build powerful generative AI applications? That sort of services such as Bedrock are really helpful in the fact that they provide a bit of a managed experience. We don't really want to look at the hardware or kind of infrastructure layer, and we want an easy way to just talk to our foundation models. We just want to say, this is the model we're using, this is what we're trying to use it for. Now, can you take care of everything in the underlying kind of hardware layer for me? Can I just work with the model simply and get some inference back? So Bedrock kind of gives a serverless experience in that sense, and what we'll do in today's video is we'll explore what Bedrock itself is via the console and the SDK, understand how you can get started with it by interacting with the model, and in coming videos we'll also explore some of the more managed capabilities it has, because you can really build full-fledged generative AI applications such as using agents or RAG, or a combination of both, honestly, using this service as well. But what we'll primarily focus on is how you can get started with Bedrock itself. So this here is the landing page, but if we go into the console, which is a prerequisite if you want to follow with today's video, we'll go and click on Amazon Bedrock specifically. And if we land here at the UI, right, we'll notice that there's different foundation models available from different model providers. So model provider is the company that's fleshing out these models, and some of these are pretty popular, such as Meta, which pushed out Llama, Anthropic, which has the Claude family, and there's different ones that are accessible in this landing page itself. To gain access to these models, you can essentially go to this Bedrock Configurations tab here and go to Model Access. And within Model Access, you'll see all the different model providers and their requisite models that they're providing. Here, for the purpose of today at least, we'll just use Anthropic's Claude 3.5 Sonnet, which is one of their new models. But if you would like to test out something, you can request access basically in this model tab right here, and you can toggle and add whichever models you would like. And as I said, we'll only explore kind of inferencing with these models for getting started right now. But you'll notice that here there's different kind of features specific to generative AI as well that we can implement that come in a managed way with Bedrock itself. So we'll notice that there's prompt management, knowledge bases, which is RAG on Bedrock essentially, and agents, and these all come in a managed flavor that we'll explore later. But for us right now, the focus is, right, we can go to this playground right here to get started with in the UI, and as you can see, there's different modalities here depending on the type of model that you're working with. What we'll do is we'll select Anthropic Claude, since we have access to that right now, and we'll click Apply here. And you'll see that in this UI or widget, you can kind of configure the prompt, or you can also change some of the parameters to adjust the response if you'd like to play around with that. An option, you can add guardrails, so if there's any words you would like to omit, or just any kind of safety precautions you're taking, you could add that as well. That's also a managed experience. But very simply, we can pass in a prompt, let's say a dummy prompt such as, "Hello Claude, how are you doing today? How are you doing today?" And we'll see that we should get a response pretty quickly here. And pretty neatly too, there's also some metrics that we get, such as the input and output tokens, and then the latency that's generated from this. And you can also compare and toggle different models if you're trying to see kind of performance from a data science angle or things of that sort. But right here, you can access all of these within the base models, which shows once again the model providers and model families. Now, this is how we can work with it through the UI. A lot of us will probably end up with the programmatic aspect when we're trying to actually build an application. And for that, the easiest way to talk to Bedrock is through the Boto 3 SDK, which is the AWS Python SDK. And right here, I'll jump over into the documentation here. But essentially, Boto 3 is the AWS Managed Python SDK to interact with different AWS services. So it doesn't need to just be Bedrock. It can also be SageMaker, EC2, Lambda, whichever service you're trying to work with, essentially. But here we have all the requisite API calls, basically, to work with whatever different kind of features of Bedrock that we'd like to use, whether it's guardrails, agents, or just simply performing model inference, as we will in this case. So right here, I have a Jupyter Lab environment where we'll run this notebook end-to-end, which I've linked down in the comments for you to access. But here we'll show a use case of just taking Claude 3 Sonnet, accessing it via the Boto 3 SDK, and how you can work with this end-to-end essentially. And Claude 3 Sonnet, just for your own notice, is a multimodal model, so we'll see how you can work with both image and text data here. This Jupyter Lab environment, for context, is on SageMaker. It's a managed ML service that comes with IDEs as well for machine learning development within AWS. So I'm just using it in-house here, but you don't have to do it on SageMaker. You could also do it locally, wherever you have your AWS user basically configured to be able to access Bedrock with Boto 3. That should be good to go. So that would be the AWS configure via the CLI, or you can set up your user even locally, wherever it is that makes most sense for you. But right here, if we jump into this notebook for Claude Sonnet Bedrock right here, we'll see that we'll have a few things in this directory if you want to download that, some of the images that we'll be working with. But let's get started first with understanding how we can even access Claude 3's model IDs. So like I said, we'll be using Boto 3, which is the Python SDK itself for AWS. And what we do is we instantiate a few clients that is basically saying, I want to work with Bedrock. So this first client, it has access kind of to these API calls here, where we can list the different models. And this runtime client essentially runs the inference itself. So we can pass in a model ID that we're specifically working with and engage with that. So first, I would like to take a look at what are the different models I have available. So we'll just iterate through this API call right here, and we'll see there's a list of all these different model IDs and model providers that we have here. Optionally, if you don't want to run this too, you can just go to the Bedrock UI, and you'll notice that each of these models in the UI itself have the model ID. But programmatically, we can also access, right, in this case, Claude 3.5 Sonnet, what is the exact model ID that I must tell Bedrock. So this model ID is Bedrock's way of understanding what model we're interacting with and what model to pull down and essentially conducting inference with. Now here, I'm preparing my text payload. I'm going to ask a dummy question, who is Roger Federer. He's also my favorite tennis player and athlete ever, for just some fun fact or context or for whatever it's worth. But right here, I pass in that payload. And if you notice, there's a certain way I structured this in. I have my messages key here, and I structured this very specifically where I pass the payload here and I pass in an Anthropic version. This is not always consistent across all models. Every model provider has a different prompt format it expects. And you can understand this by going to this UI itself, and Bedrock pretty neatly has a sample API request shape here. So if you notice, I'm mimicking the shape for Claude 3.5 Sonnet for what it expects. But if we go back to kind of the base models here, and let's say we want to look at Llama or AI 21 Labs, so let's maybe look at Llama real quick. We'll see that it has a different one. So this is Meta's. We'll see that it has a different API request shape here. And this is true for AI 21, Cohere, wherever it is, right? All of these are structured in different ways. So it's crucial that when you work with Bedrock initially, that you structure this payload in a format that that model provider can expect. So now that we've structured this in the way that Anthropic expects, we also plug in, right? We can get into working with model inference itself. We'll see that we specify a model ID for Claude 3 Sonnet, and you can access that programmatically or via the UI, as we said. And then very simply, with that runtime client that we instantiated up here, which is to run inference, right? We specify that model ID, which is once again Bedrock's way of understanding what model to work with. And we dump that text payload and say the payload type. And while this runs, just to explain a little farther, right? This is kind of the serverless experience that Bedrock provides. We're not looking at any hardware for hosting this model. We're very simply just taking the model ID, understanding that's what we're running inference with essentially, and we're tuning that. And here in this payload, once again, you can also add different kind of parameters that you might want to toggle, such as temperature, kind of payload size, whatever it is that you might be working with. So you can also tune this a little farther as you want. But here we see a pretty accurate response. He is the greatest of all time. I am biased there. But right here we see a pretty accurate response, and that's how you can pass in a text payload. And then if we come here, we see that Claude 3.5 Sonnet is also multimodal. So what multimodal means is you can work with different modalities. So there's text, there's image, there's video, there's image and text support for 3.5 Sonnet. So what we do here is I have a picture of my dog, Milo, that I just uploaded that's pretty zoomed out. See if we can get a better glance at that right here. That's a picture of him right there. And what I've done is I want Claude to explain what exactly is in this image. So once again, while we let this run, I've specified this image content and structure in a way that Anthropic expects. So whereas before we had the type as text in our previous payload. We ensure that we specify the modality that we need here, and we can essentially have this and say what is in this image. That's our prompt that we're passing in along with that image. And then we structure again in this messages API shape that Anthropic is expecting. And here we once again see a pretty accurate representation of what we're looking at. And just one more sample for kicks if you want to, right? There might be use cases where you might have handwriting that you're transcribing. So I wrote a very dummy Python function here in the handwriting right there. Let's say that you have notes that you might be transcribing once in a real world use case, something of that sort, and you want that all summarized or described. In this case, it's a little more simple here, and it might not return the greatest output just because my handwriting is pretty bad. But right here, you can also use this just as a sample use case for a real world sample you might work with, where you might have notes or you might have transcripts that are handwritten that you might want to get summarized. But here, once again, we see a pretty accurate description of the Python function that we defined there essentially. So that was an introduction to Amazon Bedrock. There will be follow-up videos in terms of agents, RAG, how we can access and build more kind of full-fledged production-grade generative AI applications with Bedrock itself. But I encourage you to just take a look at this notebook, run it end-to-end, and thank you for watching, and until next time.